a quick recap for the first chapter. So far we started with the observation that everyone will all grow old, fall sick, and die. Because of that, the Buddha invites us to live ethically, to live in a wholesome way instead of an unwholesome way. And then we read about the difference between how we, the normal human being, the worldlings, react when we are faced with difficulties, when we are faced with pain, and how the noble disciples react. This is illustrated in the sutta called the two darts. So we will experience usually we will experience the painful feeling and also the mental suffering when we are faced with pain. But the noble disciples, they only experience the bodily pain, but not the mental pain. And then when faced with the 8 worldly conditions, what are the 8 worldly conditions? Gain and loss, fame and disrepute.
Brother Marcel, you didn't share screen?
Yes. Let me share the screen. These 8 worldly conditions. Gain and loss. Fame and disrepute, praise and blame, pleasure and pain. When we encounter these 8 worldly conditions, we are elated. And when confronted with the undecided opposites, we are dejected. But the noble disciples remain undisturbed. The last paragraph that we read is about the difference between us and the noble disciples at the more fundamental level. In the difference in the 5 aggregates, subject to clinging, form, feeling, perception, volition, information, and consciousness. We will know more details about this much later on in the book at page 300 plus. Okay, now I'm going to continue reading from here. Agitation and turmoil afflict human life not only at the personal and private level, but also in our social interactions. From the most ancient times, our world has always been one of violent confrontations and conflict. The names, places, and instruments of destructions may change, but the forces behind them, the motivations, the expressions of greed and hate remain fairly constant. The Nikayas testify that the Buddha was intensely aware of this dimension of the human condition. Although his teaching, with its stress on ethical self-discipline and mental self-cultivation, aims primarily at personal enlightenment and liberation. The Buddha also sought to offer people a refuge from the violence and injustice that wreck human lives in such cruel ways. This is apparent in his emphasis on loving kindness and compassion, on harmlessness in action and gentleness in speech, and on the peaceful resolution of disputes. Yeah, so this paragraph explores not just the affliction in our personal lives, but also in our social interactions. From the most ancient times, our world, humans, has always been one of violent confrontations and conflict. And this is very apparent considering the current war. The names, places, and instruments of destruction may change, but the forces behind them, the motivations, the expressions of greed and hate remain fairly constant. Yeah, so the Buddha also touched about this part of our world. The next paragraph, Sister Billy, would you like to read?
The third section of this chapter includes 4 short texts dealing with the underlying roots of violent conflict and injustice. We can see from these texts that the Buddha does not clamor for changes merely in the outer structures of society. He demonstrates that these dark phenomena are external projections of the unwholesome proclivities of the human mind, and thus points to the need for inner change as a parallel condition for establishing peace and social justice. Each of the 4 texts included in this section traces conflict, violence, political oppression, and economic injustice back to their causes, and each in its own way locates these causes within the mind. Thank you.
Thanks, Sister Billy. So this paragraph traces back whatever we see: conflict, injustice, violence. The Buddha traces it back. Back to where? The Buddha locates these causes inside, within the mind. Okay, let me highlight this. Next paragraph, Sister Aikim, would you like to read?
Okay. Text I3(1) explains conflicts between lay people as arising from attachment to sensual pleasures, conflicts between aesthetic as arising from attachments to view. Text I3(2), a dialogue between the Buddha and Sakka, the pre-Buddhistic Indian ruler of the Devas, traces hatred and enmity to envy and niggardliness. From there, the Buddha traces them back to fundamental distortions that affect the way our perceptions and cognition process the information provided by the senses. Text I3(3) offers another version of the famous change of causation, which proceeds from feeling to craving, and from craving via other conditions to the taking up of clubs and weapons and other types of violent behavior. Text I3(4) depicts how the roots of evil, greed, hatred, and delusion have terrible repercussions on the whole society, issuing in violence, the lust for power, and the unjust infliction of suffering. All 4 texts imply that any significant and lasting transformations of society require significant changes in the moral fiber of individual human beings. For as long as greed, hatred, and delusion run rampant as determinants of conduct, the consequences are bound to be consistently detrimental.
Thanks, Sister Aikim. Quite an illustrative paragraph. The paragraph starts with the conflicts between lay people usually arise from attachment to sensual pleasures. So let's highlight this. And the conflicts between aesthetics usually arise from attachment to views. Let's highlight this as well. In other sutta, the Buddha traces hatred and enmity to envy and niggardliness. Let's define here, niggardliness. Not generous, stingy, or stingy, meager, scanty. So this sutta links hatred and enmity. What is enmity? The state of feeling of being actively opposed or hostile to someone or something. hatred and enmity to envy and godliness. And the next sutta traces the famous chain of causation, proceeds from feeling to craving, from craving fire under conditions to taking up of clubs and weapons and all other types of behaviors. The last one depicts how from the roots of evil, greed, hatred, and delusion, have terrible repercussions on the whole society, issuing in violence. The lust for power, the unjust infliction of suffering. Let's define this word here, repercussion. And unintended consequences occurring sometime after an event or action, especially an unwelcome one. The second definition, the recoil of something after impact, probably fits more in our context. I think this last line summarized quite perfectly. For as long as greed, hatred, and delusion run rampant as determinant of conduct, the consequences are bound to be consistently detrimental. Okay, I'll continue with the next paragraph. The Buddha's teaching addresses a fourth aspect of the human condition, which, unlike the three we have so far examined, is not immediately perceptible to us. This is our bondage to the round of rebirth. From the selection of texts included in the final section of this chapter, we see that the Buddha teaches our individual lifespan to be merely a single pace within a series of rebirths that has been proceeding without any discernible beginning in time. This series of rebirths is called samsara, a Pali word which suggests the idea of directionless wandering. No matter how far back in time we may seek a beginning to the universe, we never find an initial moment of creation. No matter how far back we may trace any given individual sequence of lives, we can never arrive at first point. According to text 1, section 4.1 and 1, section 4.2, even if we were to trace the sequence of our mothers and fathers across world systems, we would only come upon still more mothers and fathers stretching back into the far horizons. This paragraph touched upon the round of samsara all of us are currently in. The Buddha traces back, we will see this when we read the sutta, traces back, recalling all his past life, and he could not discover a first point, which means that this samsara has been going on for the lack of better words, forever, and no discernible beginning. And then we also read this briefly in the Noble Eightfold Path, that if we trace the sequence of our mothers and fathers, then everyone were our mothers once in our past lives, and everyone were also our fathers in our past lives. Which past life? Not sure, but if we trace back, then at some point, we are all mothers to each other. We are all fathers to each other. Okay, let's read a few more paragraphs. Sister Billy, would you like to read?
Moreover, the process is not only beginningless, but is also potentially endless. As long as ignorance and craving remain intact, the process will continue indefinitely into the future with no end in sight. For the Buddha and early Buddhism, this is above all the defining crisis at the heart of the human condition. We are bound to a chain of rebirths, and bound to it by nothing other than our own ignorance and craving. The pointless wandering on in samsara occurs against a cosmic background of inconceivably vast dimensions. The period of time that it takes for a world system to evolve, reach its phase of maximum expansion, contract, and then disintegrate is called a kalpa, Sanskrit kalpa, and eon. Text 1.4.3 offers a vivid simile to suggest the eon's duration. Text 1.4.4, another vivid simile to illustrate the incalculable number of the eons through which we have wandered.
Okay, thanks, Sister Billy. This paragraph talks about samsara not by tracing back, but also by potential endless future. If we don't do anything about this, then we will continue to roam in samsara. As long as ignorance and craving remain intact, this process of rebirth will continue indefinitely into the future with no end in sight. In Buddhism, for the Buddha, this is the defining crisis at the heart of the human condition, our condition. We are bound to a chain of rebirth, bound to it by nothing other than our own ignorance and craving. And then the Buddha illustrates again, how long have we been wandering with a time system called kappa. We will read later on in the sutta how long exactly is a kappa. Okay, let's close off the introduction with the last paragraph. Sister Aikim, would you like to read?
As beings wander and roam from life to life, strutted in darkness, they fall again and again into the chasm of birth, aging, sickness, and death. But because their craving propels them forward in a relentless quest for rectification, they seldom pause long enough to step back and attend carefully to their existential plight. As text I 4.5 states, they instead just keep revolving around the 5 aggregates in the way a dog on a leash might run around a post or pillar. Since their ignorance prevents them from recognizing the vicious nature of their condition, they cannot discern even the tracks of a path to deliverance. Most beings live immersed in the enjoyment of sensual pleasures. Others, driven by the need for power, status, and esteem, pass their lives in vain attempts to feel an unquenchable thirst. Many fearful of annihilation at death construct belief systems that ascribe to their individual selves, their souls, the prospects of eternal life. A new yearn for a path to liberation, but do not know where to find one. It was precisely to offer such a path that the Buddha has appeared in our midst.
Okay, thanks, Sister Aikim. Let's take a look. This paragraph, if we keep wandering from life to life in samsara, we will fall again and again. Into what? Into the chasm of birth, aging, sickness, and death. Let's define chasm here. Chasm, a deep fissure in the earth rock or another surface. This is the literal definition. So we will keep falling into the valley of the chasm chasm of birth, aging, sickness, and death, but our craving propels us forward in a relentless quest for gratification. We seldom pause long enough to step back and attend carefully to this existential plight. The text illustrates with a simile of the 5 aggregates in the way a dog on a leash might run around a post or pillar. This sentence highlights that most beings, most humans, live immersed in the enjoyment of sensual pleasures, others driven by needs for power, status, and esteem, pass their lives in vain attempts to feel an unquenchable thirst. Many fearful of annihilation. Let's take a look at this word. Annihilation, destroy, utterly, obliterate, defeat utterly. So many fearful of destruction and death construct belief systems that ascribe to their individual selves, their souls, the prospect of eternal life. And then a few yearn for a path to liberation, but not sure where to find one. And it was because of this, it was precisely to offer such a path that the Buddha has appeared in our midst. Finally, we have finished the introduction in 3 days. Yeah, not too bad. The subsequent days, we will finally dive into read the sutta itself. And then we can refer back to the introduction for further explanation. 愿消三障诸烦恼，愿得智慧真明了。不愿罪障细修除，实是常行菩萨道。阿弥陀佛。